Welcome back to my series on simple flies and not quite as simple flies that I catch most of my trout on. I'm Raj Kletke, and today we'll be tying and fishing a pheasant tail nymph. While I've listed this fly as not quite as simple to tie as some of the other flies, it's certainly not difficult, and I consider it an absolute must in your fly box. I've tied the pheasant tail nymph before in previous series, and there are numerous videos online about how to tie it. So again, I'm using only still photos in this series, assuming that you have some fly tying experience. While a few more steps than the simple flies we've been tying, the only difficult thing with this fly is because you need it in small sizes. I tie this from size 12 to 24, but size 18 and 20 are the sizes you absolutely need. Tie the other sizes as the need arises. This is an 18 1X heavy hook, but a standard dry fly hook is fine also. I usually don't use 2X long hooks unless I'm adding a bead head. I use 8/0 thread, or even finer on small hooks. I'm using brown thread here, but black, olive, gray, etc. are all fine. I do generally reserve black thread for my non-bead head but weighted nymphs, so I can easily tell them apart from my non-weighted nymphs, but suit yourself. When working with small flies, I often start with the tail longer than it should be and hold it loosely in place with 2 loops of thread, and then pull the fibers to the proper tail length, being sure to keep the tail on top of the hook. Anchor the fibers in place as you wind the thread forward to the abdomen tie-off point. If you haven't already, break off excess fibers. On a size 18 and smaller, I leave 1 fiber for the abdomen and bend it back. These small pheasant tail nymphs will often be used to represent blue-winged olives, which have very skinny abdomens. As I'm anchoring my pheasant tail fiber, I also anchor in my copper ribbing and place both back to the tail of the fly, keeping the fiber on the far side and the ribbing on the near side. I take my thread and fiber forward and then reverse wind my ribbing. I often put a few extra wraps of copper ribbing, which will be under the thorax, for a little added weight, and then tie off, bringing my thread to the back end of the thorax. There I tie on a few flashaboo fibers on top, and a peacock curl. After winding the peacock curl forward to make the thorax and tying it off, I fold the flashaboo over the top, tie it off, and lock it in place. I usually add a few pheasant tail fibers as legs. Get them in a vertical clump, then pinch them tightly in place on the far side with your left hand and use a distribution wrap to carry the fibers to the bottom and sides of the hook before locking them in place and tying off. Incidentally, the distribution wrap and locking materials in place are described in my beginning fly tying series, so if you don't understand these, please review that series. The finished pheasant tail nymph should have a skinny abdomen and a slightly thicker thorax. Pull up some rocks and examine the blue-winged olive nymphs in your water for size and silhouette. Before we continue, let's also tie a very simple version that works well in size 18 and smaller, particularly the 20s and smallers. Tie in the tail feathers just as you did before. After tearing or cutting off all but 1 fiber, I use my rotary vise to wind the thread and fiber forward together in a parallel fashion, which is described in my rotary vise technique series. Tie the fiber off at the back of the thorax. Tie in a peacock curl and wind it forward to create the thorax, and then tie it off, making a small head. This fly has no separate ribbing, no flashback, just a tail, abdomen, and thorax. It only takes a few minutes to tie, and yet it works quite well in the small sizes. In the small sizes, the thin abdomen and the silhouette of the simple version below the dime is often better for blue-winged olive nymphs, but I still prefer the full version on my size 18 and larger. Both fish well in the appropriate sizes. So, now it's time to fish the pheasant tail nymph. I believe the pheasant tail nymph is a great imitative Imitative Nymph for mayflies, especially for the crawlers and small swimmer nymphs, which are the mayfly nymphs most likely to be found in the drift. So I commonly use the pheasant-tail nymph on mayfly waters for searching. In the size 18 and 20, it's especially good prior to a blue-winged olive emergence. Since various species of blue-winged olives emerge throughout much of the season, this is a very common occurrence. In other words, I use the pheasant-tail nymph much of the time I'm trout fishing. You should too. And you already know how to fish the pheasant-tail nymph. Often you'll fish it as a dropper off a weighted nymph and fish it like we did with the minke earlier in this series. You may also fish it shallow as a dropper off a dry fly, especially during an emergence. If fishing it deep as a dropper, I vary my point fly depending on the organisms present in that part of the stream or river. If there's a lot of sow bugs or scuds, I may use the minke. If there's a lot of stoneflies or large mayflies, I usually use a size 10 or 12 squirrel-tail nymph or hare's ear nymph. If a lot of caddis, I may use a size 14 caddis larva appropriate for the season. If I'm not getting any strikes, I'll change flies after about 20 minutes, but I may go back to using the pheasant-tail nymph again a little later, closer to the anticipated blue-winged olive emergence. If fishing shallow as a dropper off a dry fly, commonly this will be during an emergence, especially of blue-winged olives. Use a done or late-stage emerger of what's emerging as the dry fly and an unweighted or floating pheasant-tail nymph of the proper size as the dropper. Essentially, you'll be fishing it like we fished the WD-40, so you may want to review that part of this series. I'll usually start a blue-winged olive emergence with the WD-40 as my dropper, but may switch to a pheasant-tail nymph if needed. For most other surface mayfly emergences, out of habit, I'll start with the pheasant-tail nymph or a soft hackle as my dropper. The relative few and simple patterns we've tied have given us some very effective flies for some of the most common situations you'll face on a trout stream. However, we still haven't covered caddis emergences, which are also relatively common on trout streams and rivers. So join us next time when we tie the sparkle pupa, the fly to use during a caddis emergence. Yes, it is a little harder to tie, but it's well worth the extra effort. I'm Raj Kletke, and I'll see you soon.